Recently, my dad was working in his garden and he found this small piece of pottery. I have no idea what year it comes from, and I had to ask my uncle for some more details about it. But it seems to be part of a jug that came from William Duggan Grocers. William Duggan was a business in Carlow Town, which is gone now, but was a really important part of the town when my parents were young. This comes from a jug that was used to retail stout to customers, but a very similar practice was in place for whiskey as well. So today we're going to talk about how this piece of pottery, a cheeky Nagin, and two words printed above the door of many pubs around Dublin City connect to one of the least understood, but in my opinion, most important traditions in Irish whiskey history. Distillation in Ireland has a long and storied history, which we might talk about more in further episodes. But by the late 19th century, there were two primary products being distilled on the island of Ireland. The first one was whiskey, which was by and large being made in legal, regulated distilleries, and illicit poaching. Poaching had been outlawed by the then British government in 1661, but was still being made around the country. Irish whiskey was at its absolute peak of production during this period. It's estimated that about 88 licensed distilleries were making up to 30 million gallons of whiskey a year. What this meant was that by the 1860s and 1870s, about 3/4 of all the whiskey consumed in the world was being made in Ireland, and Irish whiskey, particularly Dublin pot still whiskey, was the drink of choice for millions around the world, from the dock workers and factory workers of Dublin to the royal courts of European houses. For today, we're going to look at one particular aspect of Irish whiskey history: the rise, fall, and resurgence of Irish whiskey bonders and independent bottlers. These merchant traders were incredibly common about a century ago before almost vanishing completely, and thankfully they have seen a revival in the last 10 years as interest in Irish whiskey has generally increased. Anyone who's ever been out in Dublin might have noticed the words whiskey bonder over the door of some of their favourite pubs. Sometimes it's written as whiskey merchant or spirit merchant, basically meaning the same thing. Very few of these pubs still operate as bonders, but for long established family owned pubs, this can be a proud part of the heritage of their family business. But what is a whiskey bonder? Simply put, a bonder is a merchant who buys whiskey in large wholesale quantities from distilleries and then retails it under their own brand. This might involve other activities like storing, maturing, blending, bottling and labelling the whiskey themselves, but it might be as simple as just buying the cask and bottling it directly. The word bonder comes from the bond, or the special type of license that they have to avoid paying tax on the product until it is sold. In this video, although they're not exactly the same thing, we're going to use the words bonder and independent bottler reasonably interchangeably, because that's the way they would have been viewed in Dublin at the time. To look back at the small piece of pottery that my dad found in his garden, we need to talk about the bottom of Dublin Street in Carlow, which is still often known as Market Cross because of the number of traders and market stalls that operated here about 100 years ago. Looking at the piece of pottery, we can see that it's only a tiny fragment of what was obviously originally a jug, but we can make out some of the words on it. For example, Duggan, Grocer and Carlow are really clearly still visible. I used some information I was able to find to fill in some of the gaps in it, and it does seem likely that this was used to retail stout, because we can see the very tail end of the word stout in the top right hand corner. The reason that these jugs would have been used at the time was so that the merchants or the traders could buy products like stout or whiskey from distilleries and retail it on a small scale to consumers. And what that would look like is probably buying by the cask and then removing the whiskey from the cask and filling up bottles that were available in the shop and could then be returned after the product had been enjoyed to be refilled or to be moved on and used with another customer. Although this seems like a really silly system now in a world where we're actively trying to move away from single-use packaging, it's become so common, this really was the most efficient way for these kind of products to be distributed at the time, and we'll take a little bit more of a look at that now. Duggins of Carlow opened on July 11th, 1930, when this advertisement was placed in the Carlow Nationalist newspaper. The business premises was purchased by Pat Duggan for £850, or about €60,000 today. This was how the shop looked when Pat Duggan and his family took it over. Although Pat continued the main trade of the business he had bought, which was retailing fresh and cured meats, he also sold a variety of products including jam, tea, tobacco, stout, and likely whiskey. Duggins of Carlow is far from the biggest or the most important example of a business that was using bonding as a trading practice at the time. But for me, it represents a really cool piece of local history, and I think it does go to show just how commonplace this practice was about 100 years ago in towns and villages around Ireland. Whiskey bonders originated as an integral part of the supply chain for distilleries in Ireland. For centuries after licenses started being issued for people to distill legally in Ireland, it was incredibly uncommon for a distillery to bottle their own product. They depended on these bonders, many of whom operated as merchants or publicans, to take whiskey in wholesale quantities and break it down to a level where it was ready for distribution to individual customers. Very often this would involve having the whiskey labelled in a way that met certain regulations, like including the name of the distillery and including some information about where that whiskey had come from. This was standard operating procedure for all kinds of household names in the world of Irish whiskey. Cork Distilleries Company's first product that was bottled in-house was their old Map of Ireland pure pot still Irish whiskey, which started being bottled by the company in 1877. Jameson didn't start bottling in-house for nearly another century, with their first in-house bottled product being Crested 10 in 1963, which is now sold as Jameson Crested. To explore this further, I called into Ryan's of Parkgate Street in Dublin. Not only is this a great place to pop in for a pint or a whiskey, but they also have some really cool whiskey themed decor on the walls around the pub. I was chatting to the barman the last time I was in, and he was explaining to me that Ryan's is actually a listed building, which means that they can't take a lot of the decor down or change very much within the pub, even though a lot of it is actually quite valuable. What I was interested in today was popping in to see the signed whiskey agreements, contracts and bottling conditions that they have on the wall, dating all the way back to the 1950s, which allowed them to operate as a bonder. And we're going to take a look at those documents now. So I've pulled a copy of the documents up on my laptop so we can take a look through them together. There's a slight glare on some of them because I had to take the photos through glass, so apologies for that, but it is quite clear and we are able to make out the vast majority of the information. I just do want to say thanks as well to Ryan's of Parkgate Street for letting me take photographs of these documents, and to the bar staff for being really helpful, or as helpful as they could be, because unfortunately a lot of the information has just been lost to time when I wanted to ask them questions. So the first document we have is a receipt from Powers, who were distilling at John's Lane at the time, and is dated the 7th of January 1956, and it's addressed Mr. W. Ryan and Son, which was William Ryan's, bought of John Power and Son Limited casks of whiskey in bond. Down below, we can see that each cask is given a number, so it's really interesting to see that, you know, even though a modern distillery is a very different place than the distilleries in the 50s in Dublin, cask management is still something that they were trying to stay on top of, and that really took a lot of attention to make sure it was done right. The next listed is contents, so I'm imagining that that's the volume of the cask, and then beside it is proof. I'm imagining that that's the ABV percent as opposed to the American proof system, because the two casks are coming in at 66.5 and 66.9. And then over on the right hand side, we can see the price that was paid for the two casks of whiskey that were being sent over. I don't know if these casks were a new make that was being sent over to be held in bond until it matured, or whether it was mature spirit that was ready for distribution. It doesn't give that information on the receipt. The next document, which I've had to fill in a couple of very small gaps in, anything that I filled in is using red text, so it's only very small parts, but just to make sure that you could read the entirety of the document. So at the top you have the same address again, Mr. William Ryan, Parkgate Street in Dublin, and down below you have all of the regulations that the bonders were expected to abide by if they were going to buy whiskey in bond from Jameson. It says important revised label contract, and it sets out really strict and clear parameters on what the bonders were and weren't allowed to do when they were bottling this whiskey. So blank spaces to be filled as required, to be signed by the owner of the business. The contract must be signed in the presence of a witness. The contract has to be returned within 14 days. No wording other than the particulars required. And the bottle illustration shows the proper placing of our bottling material. We draw your attention in particular to the foot label issued by us in this country. And then we can see the image of the diagram of how they expected it to be bottled from Jameson's really clearly, and all the things that they wanted to be printed on the label, and the spaces that were left blank for the bonder to put their own name on it or put any other information they wanted to list on it. What really stood out to me with these three documents, particularly with the labelling contract, was that these distilleries at the time, although they were distributing through a wholesale system, they were sending whiskey by the cask out to these bonders and asking them to bottle it and sell it on to consumers. They didn't view themselves as just being in a wholesale role in the supply chain. If you're a wholesaler and you sell 100 tons of something onto somebody, what they do with it is not really any of your concern. What we see here from Jameson is that they were really keen to make sure that things were done the way that they wanted them to be done. There was no room for somebody to go make up their own label, slap it on the bottle and send it off. They wanted to make sure that Jameson's whiskey was labelled as John Jameson and Son Dublin whiskey, and that everything was being done in accordance with what is quite a strict and detailed contract. But where did bonding as a practice originate? Well, we don't entirely know. We have really detailed records of how much whiskey was made and sold in Ireland, but the vast majority of these are tax records, just to make sure that the correct customs and excise was paid on whiskey as it was being distributed in Ireland. Nowadays, everything about supply chain is digitally logged and tracked, but back in the day that wasn't the case. Ultimately, we don't really know why distilleries decided to distribute through a network of bonders, because they didn't write it down for a simple reason. They didn't think that hundreds of years later, anybody was going to care. That being said, we can draw some ideas and clues from the history of the time. The first reason the bonders were probably seen as a good option for distribution to the general public was transport logistics. Diesel trucks didn't become common in Europe until the 1930s, so for the vast majority of the time period we're talking about, distribution was being done by horse and cart. In fact, breweries and distilleries at the time would have had dozens of horses and a dedicated staff to take care of them. When transporting product over cobbled streets using a horse and cart, it's much easier to transport 8 or 10 casks than it is to transport dozens, maybe even hundreds of individual bottles. Secondly, glass as a packaging material is a much more recent development than a lot of people realise. Up until the mid to late 1800s, producing glass bottles on an industrial scale just wasn't feasible. That meant that through the bonders, for example, whiskey would have been distributed in earthenware jugs. These were heavy, inefficient to transport, and liable to breakage, which would have resulted in a loss to the distillers. Finally was the fact that around that time, most people in Ireland were drinking their own local whiskey. Dublin pot still was seen as the premier spirit, with Belfast whiskey only very slightly below it. But the vast majority of people were drinking whiskey made in a regional distillery that was distilled within 10 or 20 miles of where they lived. This meant that packaging into glass bottles, which makes global distribution possible for modern distilleries, really wasn't something that they were concerned with. Ultimately, it just comes down to logistics. Now in the modern day, we tend to kind of mythologize Irish whiskey, and we love the stories of the old days of old distilleries around Dublin. But at the end of the day, these people were businessmen. They were trying to make as much profit as possible in the most efficient way, and so bonders were the best way for them to do that at the time. So if Irish whiskey bonders were such an integral part of the whiskey industry, and so many businesses that operated as bonders are still really proud of that part of the heritage of their business, why did it go into decline? Well, first of all, there were the reasons that led to the decline of all areas of the Irish whiskey industry. This included 2 world wars, prohibition in the USA, which cut off the biggest export market for Irish whiskey, and a trade war with the British Empire following Irish independence. But on top of this, there was one very specific problem that applied to bonders and absolutely crushed the trade in the early 20th century. This is the label from a bottle of Duncan Allardyce & Co., which was a brand of whiskey produced by the Darcy & Co. distillery, which was based in Newry and operated from 1817 to 1917. On the bottom of the label, you can see a message which reads, "This label should be destroyed as soon as the bottle is emptied to prevent its fraudulent use afterwards." Although this whiskey was more than likely bottled in-house by the distillery themselves, this message at the bottom of the label really points to one of the issues that started to come to the fore and was one of the main reasons behind the really rapid decline of bonders in the early part of the 20th century. Imagine you're a less than scrupulous trader in Dublin in the late 1800s. You can buy proper pot still Dublin whiskey and retail it at a 10 or 20% markup. The money's not bad, but by the time that you've gone to the effort of sourcing, buying, holding, bottling, labelling and selling the whiskey, you're certainly not making a fortune. Your profit margins would be way higher if, for example, regional whiskey, cheap grain alcohol, or even illicit poaching was able to be sourced instead. Truths About Whiskey by John Jameson is one of my favourite books about Irish whiskey. Originally published in 1879, it is a genuinely first-hand historical document. Even though it contains some seriously outdated language and is clearly biased in favour of Jameson, his family and other Dublin distilleries that he respected, we can learn a lot about what was going on in the whiskey industry at the time from someone who was an integral part of it. This was not originally published as a book. It was published as a series of pamphlets for Jameson to draw attention to what he thought were the biggest issues in the Irish whiskey industry. In chapter 5, The Growth of Silent Spirit into Sham Whiskey, he says, "A dealer would buy from a provincial distillery 1,000 gallons or so of a coarse, new, strongly tasted, genuine Irish pot still whiskey, and at some bonded warehouse, say at Belfast, would blend this with another 1,000 gallons of silent spirit, imported for the purpose. He would then have 2,000 gallons of a liquid which he would sell under the name of whiskey. The real whiskey in the mixture would, perhaps, be worth 4 shillings 6 per gallon, and the silent spirit would, perhaps, be worth 2 shillings 6. The former would be too strongly tasted, the latter would have no taste at all. It is obvious that the effect of mixing the two would be to produce a milder liquid than the genuine whiskey employed, and that the mixture might be passed off as having greater age or originally better quality than it really possessed." He goes on to detail a series of instances where Dublin pot still whiskey was found to be cut or mixed with Scotch, grain alcohol, which he refers to as silent spirit, or cheaper provincial whiskey. This underlies a problem that really began to emerge for the distilleries around the time, which was that no matter how careful they were with their quality control procedures, or how much care and attention they put into their product, they had absolutely no guarantee of the quality of what was being sold to the customers with their family's name stamped on the label. A similar problem existed for bonders around the time, as all but the most reliable and trusted of bonders couldn't prove to their customers that what they were selling them wasn't cut with cheaper and sometimes even dangerous alcohol. As the Irish whiskey industry went into decline in the early 20th century, so did the bonders. It's important to remember that some companies managed to keep the tradition alive, like Mitchell & Sons, who began bonding in the early 1900s and still maintain the practice, bottling these spot whiskies distilled in Middleton, which are really, really popular to this day. However, as the mid-20th century arrived, most distilleries just decided it was easier to bottle their own product or close their doors, and the practice died out almost entirely. Thankfully, all of this began to change in the early 2010s when the Irish whiskey industry saw a massive revival. Some of this revival has come thanks to a number of really passionate and dedicated people who have decided to return the art of bonding and independent bottling to Ireland. I personally think that we're much better for it, as they put out amazing releases consistently and are given a new angle to an old tradition. Just before we get to talking about the new independent bottlers and bonders, I wanted to touch really quickly on the topic of sourcing. Sourcing is where a company, usually a distillery, will buy liquid, they'll buy spirit in from another distillery, and then they'll bottle that, label it, and sell it under their own brands. Now, this sounds really like the definition that we've been using of bonding so far in this video. The key difference is why sourcing is done, and it's done for completely different reasons. I'll give you two really good examples. The first is, you will notice that if you're tuned into the Irish whiskey industry, that a lot of the new distilleries have come online in the last 5 to 10 years. When you start a distillery, there's an absolutely massive financial and time investment gone into that. And if you're interested in selling whiskey, when you start laying down stock after you fire up those stills for the first time, you can't sell anything labelled whiskey for a minimum of 3 years legally in Ireland. A lot of brands will choose to leave it a little bit longer than that even. They'll leave it to 4 to 5 years, maybe longer, until it gets the flavour profile that they are really happy with. In the meantime, how can you have a little bit of revenue, a little bit of money coming through the door? Well, you can source whiskey from another distillery who makes really high quality spirits and bottle it under your own labels and sell it to build a customer base while your stock is aging and is getting ready to be sold. Another example of why someone might source is if they want to create a blend. The vast majority of the blends in Ireland are going to be a mixture of either pot still or malt and grain whiskey. To make grain whiskey, you have to have a column still. Some distilleries don't have the money or the space to put in a column still. If you've ever seen a big column still, they're huge. They're really tall and narrow, so they're difficult to fit in some distillery spaces. What a lot of these distilleries will do is they will purchase really high quality grain alcohol from one of a number of distilleries in Ireland that mass produce grain alcohol for this purpose, and then they will use that in their blends to bring that to market. So both of these practices, bonding and sourcing, are completely legitimate. In fact, sourcing has allowed a lot of brands to survive who may not have been able to survive those first few turbulent years in any distillery's history, where it's hard to generate revenue because your stock has been laid down and is getting ready for the day that it will be released as delicious whiskey. The two main differences between bonding and sourcing in terms of how it comes to us as a consumer: very often a bonder will be keen to tell you where their stock has come from, or they'll certainly have no problem telling you where the stock has come from in the vast majority of situations. On the other side of that, someone who is sourcing will very often keep that a bit more quiet. There's usually business agreements and NDAs and that kind of stuff where they're not as free with that information. The second key difference is that very often people who are sourcing are either building or have a distillery that's waiting to become revenue generating, and they're planning to move on and release their own products, that stuff that they have distilled themselves in the long term. Usually with bonders, that's not the case. Bonders usually are not building a distillery. They are just trying to get together a portfolio of casks and put together an amazing selection of whiskies, but they've no intention of distilling themselves. So for today, we're going to take a look at one of the brands that I really enjoy from this new wave of bonders and independent bottlers that have really brought the traditional practices back in the last 10 years or so. WDConnell, who we're going to look at today, actually refer to themselves as a whiskey merchant. So I'd love to know and chat to Dahi at some stage about where he sees himself as falling on that spectrum. But WDConnell was set up by Dahi O'Connell, and they now bottle in Kilmacthomas in County Waterford. Dahi had a whole range of jobs before he set up WDConnell, some of them in the kind of nightlife spirits industry, and some of them not. And when he came back to Ireland from a stint being working abroad, he set up WDConnell, and they're making some of my favourite whiskies today. The whiskey that we're looking at specifically today is the collaboration they did with Carry Out Killarney for their 20th anniversary. It's a single malt Irish whiskey, and it was distilled in Great Northern in 2016. I love the fact that independent bottlers and bonders and spirit merchants can do this kind of thing with independent bottlings. Not that distilleries and other brands can't, but I tend to find that these kind of independent bottlers tend to be a lot keener on the idea of bottling with, whether it's pubs, whether it's whiskey societies, whether it's an off-license like Carry Out Killarney. Another absolutely fantastic special bottling that I have tasted from WDConnell was a single grain that they did with Green Acres in Wexford, which I got to taste when I was eating in the Green Acres last year, and it was absolutely fantastic. To see what Dahi thinks of it himself, he describes his own business, WDConnell, on the website by saying, "We are a very different kind of whiskey maker. We do not have a distillery and we're not trying to build one. We bottle and blend the best spirits we can find to create a bottle and cask library that matches our adventurous spirit." I think it's amazing that we have so many people coming into the whiskey industry now in all these different kinds of roles. Yes, you need people going in the traditional roles as blenders, distillers, brewers in a distillery and those kind of things. But it's great to see as well that some of these people are branching out down these other avenues like independent bottling, like being a spirit merchant, and bringing absolutely fantastic releases to market. Just to talk about this whiskey specifically, on the nose, it's just a real kind of fruit punch. I love the fact that, and this is anecdotal, it might just be my experience, but I find that independent bottlers and bonders tend to be happier bottling at that slightly higher ABV, up into the kind of mid 50s. And I think that just gives some of these releases a lot of punch, because with distilleries, you're trying to maximize your profit. So a lot of them will have their cask strength releases for sure, but their main products will be bottled right down in and around the 40 to 46% range. And that just allows you to maximize liquid per cask. For me, I think the cask strength whiskies are going to be a little bit more expensive, but they are worth it in my opinion, because you get that extra flavor. You get that real kind of slow sipping experience. You're not going to hammer a whiskey like this into you in a few minutes. You're going to have a sip and just let it sit and really mature on your palate. And if you want to bottle it, or if you want to water it down, to a strength that you're a little bit more comfortable with, if you do prefer something that's down around 40%, you can do that for yourself by just adding water at home. This is an absolutely delicious whiskey on the nose and on the palate. It's got all the stuff that I love in a slow sipping whiskey like this. For me, that's just like a really well-baked cinnamon roll with raisins and maybe a little drizzle of maple syrup. It's got all that sweetness. It's got all that kind of baked goods kind of clinging to your tongue, but it's also got the freshness of fresh fruit, and it's absolutely delicious. At the Southeast Whiskey Festival last year, Dahi gave me a piece of advice that has really stayed with me and has really helped me to kind of contextualize whiskey in the last year. We were at the dinner in Green Acres and we were drinking the WDConnell single grain that they bottled exclusively with Green Acres. And I said to Dahi, I was like, God, this is a lovely whiskey. I'm usually not a big fan of single grain stuff. And he stopped me and he said, don't worry about labels, categorizations, or any of that kind of stuff. Just focus on flavor. And I think that that's a really good mindset to go into things with. If you are going to a whiskey tasting, if you are in a bar with friends, there might be something that you kind of think to yourself, oh, that doesn't sound like something I'd enjoy immediately off the bat. But if you just go into stuff with an open mind, you can really explore it in a different way and get the most out of it. And for me, this is an absolutely delicious whiskey. And if you're interested, you should definitely check out some of the WDConnell releases. The Bill Fill is kind of the classic WDConnell release that most people would have, and it might be the easiest to find if you're looking for a glass in a bar. An absolutely gorgeous drop. And they have some other releases that I got to taste recently, some Fino cask finish stuff. There's a 12-year-old now on the market as well, and yeah, just a fantastic company that I personally think really embodies all the stuff that we've been talking about in this video so far, absolutely perfectly in the modern era. I'm a massive fan of a lot of the releases that the new era of bonders and independent bottlers are putting out in 2024. But to find out more about the challenges that are facing these whiskey producers in the modern era, I decided to reach out to Michael Cowman. Cowman is one of the founders of the South East Whisky Festival. He's also worked for a wide range of companies within the Irish whisky industry, and last year he set up Redacted independent bottlers with his friend Ronan Collins. I decided to pop in and ask him a few questions about what that experience has been like. So Michael, thanks very much for chatting to me today. Appreciate it. So for people that aren't aware, maybe just tell them about, because you've taken quite a journey through the Irish whisky industry to get to this point.
So for the few that aren't aware, I suppose. I got into whiskey. I used to be in the Navy when I was living in Cork. So originally from Wexford, moved to Cork to join the Navy. And when I was down there, obviously the proximity of Cork to, Cork City to Middleton, you've all the guys who are distillers, bottlers, blenders, off-license owners, etc. And they had started the Cork Whisky Club at the time.
Yeah.
So that's back 2013, I suppose, maybe something around there. So joined that and just got really into whiskey that way and decided that was what I wanted to do with my career. So I always give a lot of credit to the likes of Conor Ryan and from Pierce Lyons and Eric Ryan of Middleton for my interest in whiskey, because they used to run, and Cork Whisky Society is still a fantastic club, but that's how I got into it. And so I started with Irish distillers, as a lot of people in the industry do, through that graduate program. So I worked specifically on Redbreast and Middleton and the Spot range, and kind of what they would call the luxury portfolio, premium portfolio in South Africa first, and then following on from that in Ireland as well. And then had a couple of different sales roles throughout Irish whiskey, so with Paddy and Sazerac most notably. And then more recently working with the team in Grace O'Malley, and Good Spirits Bottling is our production facility based up in Dundalk. So yeah.
I suppose the way that I came into contact with you originally was kind of the other things that you've done off your own bat, so the South East Whisky Festival specifically, and then Redacted. So where did the idea of Redacted come from? Because you've only been up and running just a little over a year.
A bit over a year, yeah.
3 releases, and they've all been really, really well received.
Yeah.
I've yet to meet anyone that didn't enjoy any of them. So
good.
I suppose, where did the idea of that come from? And
yeah, I suppose, like I talk about there, so I wanted to make whiskey my career and wanted to do it. So it wasn't just that it's a job for me. So the stuff like the South East Whisky Fest and Redacted as an independent bottling company came about on the back of kind of building out an entire, I just want to have an all-encompassing involvement in it. And so the idea for Redacted came about by myself and my buddy Ronan Collins. So for my 30th, I actually did a tour around Speyside and had a couple of mates working in Scotch at the time, and myself and Ronan became good friends then. And over the years, we've tended to drink a lot of Scottish independent bottlers, and there's a super tradition in Scotland of independent bottling, and people trade casks and buy casks a lot more than we have a tradition of here recently anyway. Because in Ireland, I think we have a lot of really good bonders at the moment, but we don't have so many independent bottlers. I think, so we wanted to say, we kind of said, look, why don't we try and do this? We said, how hard could it be? Turns out quite hard, but here we are. So yeah, a year later, we've got 3 releases, and we kind of want to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
It's a part-time gig for both of us, so it sometimes doesn't get all the attention that we would love to give it. But it has been a great journey so far, and yeah, a great learning, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd imagine so, yeah. One of the things that I really loved about all of the Redacted releases so far is the transparency. I think for me, but for a lot of consumers in Irish whiskey, I think that's something that they're really passionate about, and it's something that I think you do incredibly well.
Yeah.
And I suppose, is that something that just kind of happened naturally because yourself and Ronan have such a history in the industry, or is it something that you really kind of sat down and thought through how you wanted to?
Yeah, it's the core to the brand, really. And I guess the name Redacted, which sometimes we don't do a great job of explaining, is that the idea is it's almost the opposite of that. It's a bit of a play on it. The fact that in Irish whiskey, in the industry, sometimes people are quite secretive about where their liquid comes from.
Yeah.
And there's obviously NDAs and there's supply agreements and stuff involved, and we understand that. But insofar as we absolutely could, we wanted to tell you everything we could about the products, because that was the stuff we like to drink as well. Was okay, I want to know where it's from, I want to know what percent it is, I want to know the mash bill, I want to know where has this cask been, I want to know all this stuff, because it all individually makes a difference, a very small difference in a lot of cases, but it all makes a difference. And so that's very much core to the brand that and I don't think we would ever release something that we couldn't name where it was from, or we couldn't say it's from Blackwater or Cologne or Cooley or wherever. And so that's kind of, it's absolutely core to the brand, and it's what the whole thing was really built around.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really made you stand out, even kind of early on. As I said, you're only about a year in, but it's that thing of being as honest as upfront with people as possible. Because for me, since I got into whiskey, that's something that's been the major difference. You want to drink things that are tasty, but you also can learn a lot by understanding where things come from and making connections and that kind of stuff.
And I mean, our Blackwater release is a non-compliant pot still, for example, non-compliant to the whiskey technical file, because of the various mash bill in it. And I think it's a really educational whiskey as well, because you kind of go, okay, there's what do the oats do, or what does this do, and and when you're tasting a huge variety of different whiskies, and it's really educational. I think that's what independent bottlers are all about, is that when you see, particularly, again, we go to Scotland, which is the best proponent of them, when you see certain independently bottled releases, they will be totally outside the realm of what that distillery's main brand might do. So if the main brand is primarily a non-peated release, you may see a peated release coming out from an independent bottler that they bought 20 years ago, that was a trial run that didn't really work, that sat in a warehouse, so that's where you get these cool little gems through independent bottling, I think.
What do you think that we in Ireland, I say we there as in, the consumer, the industry, the producers, everything, need to do to get ourselves to a point in Ireland where we have a really strong and healthy independent bottling scene like Scotland or the US?
I think it's going to come, because the thing was, look, we've all done the story, we've all heard the story. 10 years ago we had 3-4 distilleries, now we have almost 50. And independent bottling is a function of that. It's the fact that all these distilleries are going, okay, we can now start to trade casks, and we can sell casks among each other, and there's a lot more parcels of casks that come up. Because prior to this, there really there wasn't a huge amount of opportunity to trade in a huge variety of casks. And if you go to Germany, where there's a really healthy independent bottling scene, you'll see a huge amount of Cooley releases will always come out in Germany, and there's a huge amount of stock over there. But I think to have a healthy independently bottled scene, you have to have a variety of different distilleries feeding into it. The Irish industry is good at collaboration. We're getting better at collaboration, just by virtue of the fact that the industry has to kind of improve and increase numbers, and it's the benefits of collaboration will become very evident, and as a result of that, we'll get a bigger, and there'll be more independent bottlers.
And I suppose as well, like there's a timing element to it as well, or it strikes me there's a timing element to it where, a lot of the newer distilleries have opened in the last 10 years. So for the first 3 or 4 years, they're generally sourcing. Then they're trying to bottle their own and build their own portfolio. So as you said, there's not a lot of casks there going spare that they don't have a kind of an earmarked specific use for, or specific vision for. And you look at Redacted, right? So myself and Ronan, it is a part-time thing. If you wanted to run an entire whiskey company, it's a lot more involved, and you need a lot more whiskey. You need a lot more sales. So while we can go to certain smaller distilleries and kind of go, we'll take one cask, it'll be cool, we'll do it. It'll be, if you really want to scale that up, it gets quite difficult, because distilleries in general, and we would have good relationships with a lot of them, and that's why our first releases were sourced from where they're sourced from, because we had good relationships with the guys. If you want to scale that up and all of a sudden you're going in asking for 10 casks is the same thing, it becomes a different conversation, So it's all a function, like you say, it's all a function of time. We'll get to a point where everyone's like, okay, we now have enough whiskey to supply our own brand. We have this excess here. What do we do with this? And I suppose that kind of answers another question I want to ask you, which was like, you've done 3 single cask releases so far from Cologne, from Blackwater, and the Nagins from Cooley. And I suppose traditionally what we've often seen in the industry is this idea that a brand wants to come out and they want to establish a core range. And then down the line, they'll think about doing these cool, unique, kind of small batch or single cask releases. So is that kind of why you thought that you'd start off nearly on the opposite end that we traditionally expect, where it was kind of focusing on the single casks and just wanting to show off what a distillery was about from a...
Yeah, so the core of the brand is showcasing the DNA of the distillery, number one, and that ties into the artwork on each bottle is bespoke and to the area, to an artist from the area where it's from. So just trying to bring a flavour of that, I suppose. The reason we kind of went with the single cask model was because, again, if you want to have a scalable brand that you have one core release, you need to sell quite a lot of that, you know, and it is a very involved process. And if you want to be a pour in whiskey in somewhere or whatever it is, that's a really involved process. Whereas doing it batch by batch, I won't say it's easier, but you can do it. You can target a certain time period. You go, okay, for these 2-3 months, we can sell this product and then we can go, you know? Whereas if we were to try and build that core brand, you really do need somebody on the ground, and particularly in Ireland. Like if we were just targeting Ireland, it is the most difficult market for whiskey because there's so much for Irish whiskey because there's so much competition.
Yeah, another one of the things that I want to ask you about, because you mentioned it there with the kind of personalised artwork that's localised to each release, and even other things that we don't see a lot of other companies doing, like the Nagins. Like, do you think that that's important for a modern brand to have things like that make themselves stand out? Obviously, you've got to have very high quality liquid. If the liquid is rubbish, then nothing's going anywhere. But do you think that that's something that's important for modern brands, to have these unique things that kind of are their own?
Pop and stand out. Yeah, and look, when you have small budgets and a limited team, you really have to do something to be able to stand out. So that artwork really comes into play, and even the different sizes. Ireland, for example, I love throwing this fact around, that Ireland drinks the most Nagins per capita in the world. Now, if the majority of them are €10 Nagins of vodka, so it's a bit of a challenge, but we're familiar with that size. And I think there's so many occasions for Nagins. Like we sell quite a lot through some of the stores here in Dublin, just because people will buy them going to the airport and they fit in a suitcase and that kind of thing. And that wasn't necessarily our target at the beginning, but it became quite evident very quickly that, oh yeah, that makes total sense.
Things like the Nagins, like as you mentioned, our typical association with Nagins is, I mean, it nearly became a sport for myself and the lads in college of finding the cheapest Nagin. And someone would come back with a tail of an off license that was doing a €4 Nagin. You'd be like, all right. Whereas you've flipped that on its head completely, and it's some of the most premium liquid I've ever had in a Nagin, and it doesn't feel like it should work, but it's just a brilliant.
Well, thank you. I mean, and the idea was that it makes these whiskies more affordable as well. While €45, yes, it's a lot for a Nagin, you know, in your head. It is also a 20-year-old whiskey aged in a Barolo red wine cask. So it just makes it accessible. And like once you're below that kind of 50 quid mark, it allows people, you know, it is still a good chunk of change for a lot of people, but it is accessible and allows you to, rather than spending 250 quid on a similar product, you can go, oh, this is cool, this is great value, this is delicious, and I can get this for somebody for Christmas or whenever they want it, like, you know?
Absolutely, yeah.
Number one, it's important to stand out when you have those small limited budgets. And the other thing for us is, on a back bar, you want to go in and go, what's that? You know, that's really important, that you kind of want to look a little bit different. And you're almost like the indie band, you know, it's like that slightly off-piste kind of thing that you need to be able to do to get attention. But the artists are a really important part, and I think having an artist from the area local to the distillery is really important for us and really cool. And even I remember Fiona MacDonald, who was our first artist on the Cologne, and we sat down with her and we said, look, here's the inspiration, here's the distillery, here's what the liquid is going to kind of roughly be, blah, blah. And we kind of had a chat through it. And we said, do whatever you want. And she went, clients don't mean do whatever you want. And we went, no, go. Like, I remember she sent it back, we were like, can we change that colour? And she was like, yeah. And that was it. Like, you know, that was more or less the size of it. So I think, like us, we want the product to be an expression of both the artist, the distillery, the area, ourselves. And that's kind of, without getting too lofty.
Because I remember looking at the artwork from Bottling One, and I was kind of like, okay, and naturally in your mind, I think, especially with whiskey, we tend to do this where we try and draw connections. Where I was like, okay, cool, so it's going to be themed around, you know, that kind of idea of like
animals,
Irish myths and legends or animals or something. I was like, oh, that's going to be the thing. And then shortly before the release of number 2, it popped up on Instagram what the art was going to be, and I was like, whoa, that's, you know, completely different. And there's a lot of brands wouldn't want to do that because they're kind of looking for this consistency vibe, whereas for you it's about the standout.
Exactly, and that's that single cast thing as well. So if we had a core brand, maybe there'd be more of a consistent theme. But I think for what we're currently trying to do, like, which is stand out a little bit, and we want each bottle to be almost a piece of art that you can display.
Well, I won't take up any more of your day, but have you any hints for us, I suppose, on anything else that's coming down the line with Redacted? Any more powerhouse Nagins or strange finishes?
Well, I tell you, the Nagins are a nightmare because we had to hand bottle them and hand crimp them and everything, and Ronan can't do it. Like, so he, so he just put on the label, and my hand was nearly falling off.
A lot of Nagins in a cask.
Would you believe? We don't even know how many there were. What's coming down the line? So, I guess Redacted, we are independently funded by ourselves, so we don't have the funds to lay down a huge amount of casks. So we're currently working with a couple of distilleries to get something in the works that we can release in the next little while. We have 3 or 4 very cool options that we're kind of trying to get out before March of 25. So I guess it's kind of a watch this space kind of thing, but I would imagine our aim is to do maybe 2 to 3 releases a year for the next little while, and then see how that picks up from there. So
that's brilliant.
All very sustainable.
That's the name of the game.
That's what you have to do.
Exactly. Thanks, William. Appreciate it.
Good to see you as always.
I'll see you at Southeast Whiskey Festival.
You better. Yeah, you better.
Thanks.
Cheers, man.
I really enjoyed sitting down with Michael and finding out what the experience has been like for him building up a new independent bottling company in 2024, the challenges and the opportunities that he's faced with his friend Ronan Collins. Ultimately, these companies are all as different as the products they make and the consumers they serve. But one thing is really clear: there's a massive passion with these companies and the people who run them to bring back the traditions of bonding and independent bottling in a really unique and innovative way. Ultimately, it's up to us as consumers to support these companies if we want to see them continue to grow and flourish and bring more amazing releases to the market in years to come. Bonding and independent bottling is a practice that has hundreds of years of history behind it. A really strong independent bottling culture in places like the US and Scotland proves that this is a model that can work if we in the Irish whiskey industry, both as consumers and producers, want it to work. Often releases from bonders and independent bottlers are not going to be the cheapest whiskies that you're going to find in the shop. Also, they can be a little bit more difficult to find. They're not going to appear as often in supermarkets. But I would argue that a slightly higher price point and a little bit more effort to find them can really pay off if you dive deep into what these companies have to offer. Ultimately, it's up to us as consumers to support these bonders if we want them to succeed. A great way to get familiar with these brands, if you're not ready to invest in a bottle, is to look for tastings that might be taking place in your area. Most areas will have either a pub or a whiskey society or club that will offer tastings, and some of these will be with bonders. Also, if you're attending events like Whiskey Live, take a look at the list beforehand, and if there's a bonder or an independent bottler on there that catches your eye, go up to the stand, have a chat with them and see what the brand is all about. One of the things that I really was not expecting in making this video was a change in my own attitude towards certain bottlings of whiskey. So here I have a bottle of the first Redacted release, the 001, which I bought when it came out first, and I never opened. Now, I've gotten a chance to taste this a couple of times. I had friends that had opened bottles. I've had a taste in a couple of different bars around Dublin, and it really is an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous whiskey. And I think I was waiting for a kind of an occasion to open it that was going to justify opening up a whiskey that I spent more than I would usually spend on a bottle personally on, and that was just a really, really stunning Cologne single barrel release with all that kind of Cologne punch and character that we've come to expect from that brand. I think me being nervous about opening the bottle came from the fact that it sold out pretty quickly when it was released. For me, in my own budget, it was on the more expensive side of bottles that I would typically buy, and I was kind of concerned that if I drank it over a couple of months or a year with family and friends, a sip here, sip there, and it was gone, it wouldn't be able to be replaced very easily. There's a lot of great things about having a favourite sipping whiskey. For me, it's something like a Redbreast 12, where there's always a bottle on the shelf, and once that bottle is empty, it's going straight on the shopping list to get replaced again. But there is something cool in a different way about these kind of releases from independent bottlers particularly, but also from bonders, where it's not able to be replaced really easily, and that is something that makes it special in its own way. Whiskey is not to be hoarded, it's not to be sat on a shelf and admired, even if it has amazing artwork on it from a local artist. It's to be enjoyed, it's to be shared with family and friends. So I'm going to open this bottle now because it's in the run up to Christmas and I want to share this bottle over the Christmas period with my family and friends. It's not there just to be admired, it's there for me to enjoy with other people, and I'm really looking forward to tasting it now. Am I going to be able to replace it again? No, but in a strange way, that's what's beautiful about bottlings like this. It's an absolutely beautiful release from Cologne, a single cask release at cask strength, and I'm surprised at how strong the peat is on it. It's much stronger than I remembered because it's not a peated whiskey, but it's aged in an ex-peated barrel, and it really gives a lot of that flavour and a lot of that character that people have come to expect if you've ever had a Cologne whiskey before. So I'm looking forward now to putting the rest of this bottle away until Christmas in a couple of weeks' time and getting to share a drop with family and friends who will be around over Christmas. Will I be disappointed when this bottle is empty? I absolutely will. But at the end of the day, that just means it's another opportunity to keep the adventure and the exploration of flavours rolling on and look for the next thing for us to all sit down and sip and enjoy together. I have had so much fun researching this video and learning about the history, the decline, and then the revival of bonders and independent bottlers in Ireland. And I really hope that you have enjoyed watching the video as well. And the channel moving forward, I'm hoping to make a few more of these videos, these kind of deeper dives where there's a bit more meat to the content, and it makes me do a little bit more research and learn a bit more for myself. So if you have any suggestions of titles or videos ideas that might be cool for these deeper dive videos, I would massively appreciate it. Also, if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel, that'd be absolutely fantastic. And until the next time we see each other, sláinte.